Please sit down. So Brad is going to be joining the panel, and I would like also to invite Roi Carthy from Initial Capital. He's going to be moderating this panel about entrepreneurship in Brazil, and I'm very happy to have Roi here. Roi created the Brazilian pavilion at TechCrunch Disrupt, and he's coming from a very busy week, and Brazilians outnumber everybody else again this year. Congratulations, Roi. So please sit down, and I want to also invite Anderson Tees, founder of Redpoint e.ventures, to join us, as well as Alan Taylor from Endeavor. I'm very excited to have you all here. And while I let Roi talk a little bit about his background and what he does, I'll pull the slides of Alan and Anderson, okay? All right. Yeah, well, you have it right there at the table, but sure.
I'm going to stand. All right, so this is the last panel of the day, and if you've been here, if you flew in from Brazil, this is literally the last panel of the week. You've seen probably, at least Anderson and I, about 6 times, right, at least? So, you know, we were...
7.
Yeah, well, we need new jokes and new material. It sucks. So we're going to do this a little differently. It's last panel. Let's get kind of a little more energetic before we all go home. I'll get you out of here in time, not just because necessarily I care about you, but because I have to get my brother on a plane. So, you know, it's sort of important. You know, Jewish mother, it's a story. Trust me. And another thing, let's kind of do the questions as we go. So if somebody says something interesting or smart, or you want to challenge them, let's just kind of wave to me, and I'll run up, and I'll give you the mic, and we'll do it like that. Are we all cool? Yes? Excellent. So just kind of go down the line, quick bio, and we'll start. Go ahead.
Should we let Alan start with his presentation?
Skip
Yeah?
We don't need
No.
Yeah,
No.
let's skip that.
No.
No, we won't have.
No.
Okay.
It couldn't possibly be interesting. We'll just leave it alone.
More interesting than talk.
Yeah, you know.
All right.
Go ahead.
My gift to you is no slides.
Thank you.
My name's Alan Taylor. I work with a group called Endeavor. Endeavor supports high growth, we call them high impact entrepreneurs in emerging markets all over the world. We're in 17 different countries. 6 of those are in Latin America. And we've been working in Brazil for about 11 years now. So how many people in the audience have actually heard of Endeavor in Brazil? Okay, so we're on the right track to something there. My role, I actually run an office for us here in San Francisco. So we have a small team in Silicon Valley that connects our portfolio of 500 companies all over the world to great mentors and investors like GA here in the Valley and elsewhere. So I'm excited to be here and hopefully do something interesting that doesn't involve jiu-jitsu or fighting or whatever.
Or
Keep
food.
going.
Or diet.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, now that you've already filled out your survey saying what you thought of the conference and you're going to die because you had feijoada for lunch, we present the last panel.
Anderson?
Hi everyone, great honor to be here. My name is Anderson Tees. I'm the co-founder of Redpoint e.ventures, which is a venture capital firm in Brazil. It's a new one. We started a year and a half ago. We raised our first fund. It's $130 million focused for investments in Brazil and the region. And we invest in the internet sector. We are a joint venture of 2 funds from the Silicon Valley. So that's why we got our long name, Redpoint e.ventures. These are our sponsoring funds, and they help us a lot. I'll walk you through a little bit of our mission, but basically what we want to do is very much in line with what Bay Brazil does, which is we are bringing the Silicon Valley style of venture capital investing to Brazil. So that's why we created the fund. That's why we have these set up with a local team and a local fund in Brazil with close ties here with the Silicon Valley. And we invest in early stage companies, what we call Series A. So it's the first institutional round of investment in the company. So we like to say we invest in very big companies when they are still very small, and when they are big, we bring them to guys like Brent from, yeah, absolutely, from GA and Brad, so that we can keep growing the businesses. So the idea is to invest in companies with really big potential to grow not only in Brazil, but also in the region. And really honored to be here. Happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you. Right, we already know?
Gave my background.
Okay. Finally, about me, my name is Roi Carthy, or as my hotel prefers, Roi Carthy. I'm managing partner of Initial Capital. We invest in Israel and in Brazil. It's a funny combination, but it's the result of the background of the founders rather than an intelligent strategic perspective. Although I have to say that as time goes by, we find it's actually making more and more sense and less surprising. But I have to say it was more the background, our personal background, than anything else. So with that out of the way, we're looking at the new wave, and I'm an internet guy, so I apologize. You guys write different checks for different things, but I'm more of an internet guy, so I'll try to, when I speak of startups and technology, I'm more in that kind of world. So let's go back to the 25 trips of yours in Brazil, and sort of the new wave that we're seeing now in Brazil, which is can be categorized anywhere from between like 5 and 3 years ago where it began. So what are you seeing? What are you all seeing as different since since 2007, let's say?
Yeah, sure. I'll give my perspective, and like we talked about, it's a bit of a later stage perspective than Anderson and Alan. But I think it's fascinating. I mean, I remember my first trip, our first investment in Latin America was Mercado Libre. And in very much, kind of Marcos, Hernan, Nicolas were kind of pioneers. I mean, they had the help of Endeavor and Alan's organization to really get going and get started. But there weren't as many entrepreneurs at that time, and they kind of, as you see here in Silicon Valley, a lot of it is kind of learning from those that have made the mistakes before you and have really, kind of seeded that ground. And so what I found more recently, although actually Decolar was also started in the same kind of vintage around 99, 2000. The case of the Mercado Libre guys, they all kind of banded together from their time here at Stanford, saw what was going on at eBay. The Diramante guys had banded together from their time at HBS, and the Stanford guys kicked their ass, and then acquired them. I think in that situation, they made a lot of mistakes along the way. I mean, Mercado Libre in many ways, I think, was able to kind of thrive through that period. But I think now you have an environment where you have guys like Kazakh Ventures that are former Mercado guys, e.ventures, and what Anderson and the Redpoint folks are doing. You've got Mondashis. You've got a number of really interesting entrepreneurs and folks that have done it before that can offer that advice, that guidance, that capital to help really drive the next group of startups. And so that's been really encouraging. And so every time I go down to Sao Paulo, Rio, and even Argentina and BA, you see these really interesting companies that are emerging, and they all started maybe in some ways there were ideas that they saw from their time here in the U.S. But in many ways, I think the next leg of trips that I've seen are really innovative ideas that are very specific to that local market. Yet, bring some of the best practices that you see, coming from Silicon Valley. So I'm very encouraged. I mean, I think just the level, I'd say I don't know if it's 10x or 20x in terms of startup activity that I see in Brazil versus my first couple trips, but it's very encouraging.
So I come from a completely different angle. I'm Brazilian, born and raised. I lived some time abroad, and since I went back to Brazil 10 years ago, I've been working either as an investor or running internet companies in Brazil. So it's there's an internet bias to that as well. But I can tell the ecosystem in Brazil changed dramatically in the last few years, especially in the last 3 or 4 years. Not a coincidence, the market in Brazil changed a lot as well. So around 2008 to 2009, we started to get critical mass in the Brazilian internet to start building significant businesses. And in terms of how much can be built, if we look at the size of the Brazilian economy and the amount of gaps, amount of problems, amount of opportunities we still have to tap into the country, I think we are still in the very early days. Some funds were pioneers. I think, if I recall correctly, Doug was back in 2007. I was at NASPER's first time we spoke, and GA was one of the first, along with Tiger, and great few partners as well. And recently we saw a big inflow of capital. And on the VC end, it was later, around 2009. Matthias, my partner here in the audience, started going to Brazil, was one of the first ones to go together with Jeff from Redpoint, and was not one of the first one to commit with a team and a fund for the region. And we saw a lot of new energy in terms of knowledge and money go into the country in the last 3 years for the earlier stage of the development cycle of companies. So I think we are well positioned. It's definitely for anyone that is more than 5 years doing this in Brazil. It's day and night. What we have today is a lot better than what we had before. But we are still in the beginning. So I think it's very promising, and there's a lot to be built.
Okay. Alan, would you like to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I guess when you're the third one to speak, you always agree with the first two guys. But
I said this one.
I actually, to build on a little bit on each of your points, one around kind of the generations of entrepreneurs. I think Endeavor has done a lot of work now studying sort of the ecosystems and this idea of mentorship. And we actually have been able to show and track how the guys from Mercado Libre or, Romero from Buscapé or some of these more successful entrepreneurs who started out 10, 12 years ago, they're actually really important to the ecosystem now for the companies getting started today. So I think that idea of role models and examples, but then who actually go get involved as angels and mentors to the new businesses is something we've seen to be really important. To Anderson's point about it being very early, I think, I heard Fred Wilson give an amazing talk a couple years ago about generations and sort of how this works in Silicon Valley, and he was using it to talk about New York. But I think you could apply it to Brazil, or you could apply it to Buenos Aires, where, we're in the first or second sort of generation or cycle of this, where I think the future is huge. And I think little ups and downs, or hey, maybe it's not as hot and sexy today as it was 6 or 12 months ago. I think the people who are in this for the long term are going to be in it for a very long time and are going to do very, very well. And so, when I look at Endeavor's own sort of portfolio, we've helped 72 of our companies raise about $300 million in equity in the last 24 months. That's more than we'd raised in the previous 7 years. So there's very clearly something important happening, not just in Brazil, but in Mexico, in Argentina, in Turkey, in a lot of these emerging markets. And I think it's sort of just the beginning, or chapter 1.5. I don't know. There's a lot more to come.
So let me kind of lean into that in a way. One of the themes today, or one of the kind of recurring questions today, was why isn't there an Amazon of Brazil, other than Amazon, right? And so my question to you is, what happens? And this is, I guess, more the earlier, but so we'll answer it this way, until the big check. But what happens if an entrepreneur comes to you and says, "Listen, I have this crazy idea, and it's to build the Amazon of Brazil because Jeff seems to be busy with Kindle or something in the Washington Post. We're going to do it." And I'll sort of maybe half answer that as initial, and I'd be, I'm not really sure. How crazy are you? I mean, let's just kind of determine that factor, because as initial, kind of a smaller type of outfit, I am not necessarily sure I would want to try and fund an idea that big, necessarily. Okay, it really is dependent on the team and the founder and such. So I'm wondering what would happen if somebody would knock on your door and say, "Listen, I've got this Amazon for Brazil idea."
Yeah, so this is a great one for Endeavor, because we really want entrepreneurs to think as big as possible. In fact, it's one of the main things we do when we bring people here is we do these kinds of immersion and inspiration tours to try to get them to think even bigger. And I'll make a generalization that might make me unpopular in this room, but Brazilians don't think big enough. And in fact, we find entrepreneurs out of Turkey, out of Argentina, out of some of these other markets that really build huge regional, even global potential businesses. And Brazilians typically are building for Brazil. Now that's because it's pretty.
But is there anything wrong with that? Do you think? I mean, again, when we were speaking about the experience part, you need to develop experience first. Let's figure this out on our turf, so to speak, before we go outside and think much bigger. I mean, Brazil is not small. I don't know if you've noticed, but I mean, it's pretty. I mean, we find it super attractive when people ask me, "What are you doing in Brazil?" And I say, "There's 200 million of them. I mean, we're just starting, and it's huge and it's amazing. It's the size of the United States."
Right. Well, I guess to your original question, if somebody came to us and said, "We want to build the Amazon for Brazil or for Latin America," we would say, "Come on in, let's do it." We want people thinking that that big. We have one entrepreneur in Chile and one in Jordan that are trying to build the Amazon for Latin America and for the Middle East right now. You know, they're not Brazilian, but that's something that Endeavor is currently working on.
I'd love a deck. And Anderson?
I'll take the opportunity here to go back to the conversation we had many times about the copycats and take the flip
Please, go
side
ahead.
of it. I'll answer with another question. Can you explain to me why we don't have a Buscapé in the US?
You know, I mean, listen, I think there's a lot of cultural stuff. I think everybody looks at their own problems. And I think, you know, in the United States, there's the luxury to think big. You know, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of this decade. And they pulled it off kind of well. I think there's a luxury to think of a franchise that can sell 1 billion burgers. I think this is a luxury. I think Brazilians have another luxury, and that is to reinvent the local economy, which I think is an incredible challenge. And you know, I would be excited tremendously. We don't have that in Israel. You know, I mean, we're missing that. We have to go outside, you know, to the rest. We have to come to Brazil. We have to come to the U.S. and elsewhere.
Yeah. So my point is, you know, it comes with the evolution and with the opportunities. I'm not saying we will never have an Amazon in Brazil. Our barriers for, as we saw earlier today in the e-commerce panel, our challenges for payments and logistics are still very high, but they are going down. So at some point, it might make sense. From a cultural perspective, the aspects of how Brazilians buy, the cultural needs to compare prices and to get the rebate, and it's just in the culture, and it made more sense for it to evolve as a price comparison early on, and let's see what comes next. But the fact is not Brazilians are not buying because there is no cultural inclination, nor there is no Amazon because there is no e-commerce future there. I think the evolution path is going to be completely different. It is already. Where we end up, it might be with a new Amazon or, you know, different flavors of it. But it's just a different place. Sometimes you can, you know, do a cultural, no, what was the name they mentioned? Information arbitrage or geographic innovation, whatever. Sometimes you just need to cater to the needs of the country with the results, the resources that are available at that time.
Okay, Brett, before you answer that question, because I want to twist it, yes, prepare a question, because as soon as he's done, I'm going to ask you that question. So good. So that saves me from forcing people to come up with questions. So my question to you is kind of downstream, right? You know, I mean, it's rare to write a $50 to $500 million check. You're going to need some good candidates and pick up a litter kind of a thing. We don't have a litter, sometimes we even don't have one candidate. So how do you support us folks downstream? I mean, there's you guys, there's Atomico, there's Bessemer. Everybody's in there for writing a big check these days, or a lot of them are willing to write a big check, but I'm not really sure, for whom. How do you make sure you have the right deal flow in a couple of years?
Yeah, a couple of things. First, actually, I will answer the Amazon question if that's okay, just because I have a view on it. So, I mean, if you look at, I think it's a great question. I mean, I lived in China and Hong Kong from 2008 to 2011, and there is the Amazon of China, and that is Alibaba, and they've created an amazing ecosystem around it. But I think that was basically a couple of things. I think one was you had a really group of entrepreneurs that had big vision, right? I mean, Jack Ma. There's one thing that you could say about him, good and bad, is he has an amazing and grand vision. And he built a team of not just a few people, but like 20 partners. And that's, if you read in the press today, some of the challenges that's going on with kind of the IPO listing is, he wants that management team to be in control of their destiny for the future and take that really long-term point of view so that they could try and really build an even bigger and more promising kind of Amazon-like opportunity in China, not just in the e-commerce way, but in cloud computing and what AWS is doing, in payments, like they're doing with Alipay, and really transform the entire Chinese economy. And I would not bet against them. I think to Anderson's point, there hasn't been, I think there's very few entrepreneurs that have had that vision. I've been pleasantly surprised that someone like Marcos at Mercado Libre has continued to kind of stick with it. He's incredibly detail-oriented, so while he's got a grand vision for it, he is sitting on the same floor as the UI team and is in there every day making UI changes alongside the engineering team in a way that I haven't seen with other entrepreneurs. So he's got big vision, but he's also very detail-oriented. And I think that's that. If there were one company that could build that kind of vision, I think it could be someone like Mercado Libre, and someone like Marcos that has really long-term aspirations for that business. But I think you have had the concept of people not necessarily thinking big enough yet, and Alan references as well. And I think once that happens, there will be. Now, I won't. Now, to answer your question on whether we will fund that or not, I quite frankly don't know I would, personally, because I think there is a risk profile to that idea that happens in Brazil that's different in the sense that, similar to India, where you have many Brazilians really like Google. They really like Amazon. They really think very highly of these global brands in a way that in China there's a very much domestic orientation, not just because of the Great Firewall, but people don't have that same affinity towards these global internet companies. You look at the example of Facebook versus Orkut, right? Orkut was as close to a local social network as you could possibly get because you had almost 100 million or hundreds of millions of Brazilians and Latin Americans that could have created now it's shame on Google for not innovating around it, but could have created that kind of local regional brand, and it just got its butt kicked by Facebook because of the network effect and the global aspiration, and also the affinity of Brazilians and Latin Americans to a Silicon Valley brand like Facebook and what that could offer to them in terms of technology. So I think that those are kind of two questions, but I think it may happen. I don't know. I'm not as convinced as I am in markets like China or others that there will be kind of an Amazon for that region. And then I think to Anderson's point, I think Alibaba, longer term, those ideas and many of the Chinese ideas are bringing their way here. I mean, quite frankly, Tencent is a $92 billion market cap company in the world. Alibaba probably a $100 billion company, and the ideas and things that they're bringing forward, despite people thinking about copycats, are well in advance of what Facebook and others are doing. There's a company called YY that went public last year, which is an awesome company, and it brings the idea that Skype wasn't really able to execute, or AirPlay wasn't able to execute in terms of what Google Hangout and kind of the collaboration that people are having. So I think there's going to be a lot of things. I'm hopeful that will come out of Brazil, and I'm hopeful that will come out of Latin America in general. I haven't necessarily seen it yet, but I'm hopeful that it will come. And to your question on kind of seeding that ground, I think the challenge is, and if you look at the examples of, we come a little bit closer to what would be the exit for VCs. For us, an IPO is not an exit. In some cases, we invested more capital into Mercado Libre as part of the IPO. We were debating to buy more stock in Lynx when they went public. So our perspective is, you haven't seen that many exits, right? You haven't seen, and you've seen, Buscapé, obviously with the Naspers situation come about. Netshoes, LocalWeb, these are other companies that might ultimately prove to have exits, and all of which that we kind of see as downstream opportunities. But there just haven't been that many. And a lot of that is, I think, either the US market requires kind of larger companies to kind of access those capital markets, or the Brazilian Bovespa. I mean, when we did the Lynx IPO, we had to raise close to $250 million of US dollar capital. I mean, there aren't many companies in the US that are going public and raising that much capital despite their size. So I think there's some natural limitations in the capital markets that do restrict that later stage development. Our perspective is we think we can compete and ultimately be well positioned to support those companies in the market because we have local people on the ground and we have global people that think big and can bring many of the best practices. I mean, Decolar, we're very close. Priceline was one of our early investments. So we're able to bring some of the know-how, some of the people, some of the expertise from that to those situations. And we think that's a big enough category where there'll be a multi-billion-dollar company. I'm friends with many of the venture capitalists in the market. Is the idea of having an open table in Brazil or in Latin America enough to be big enough to be a growth capital-oriented investment and ultimately a public entity? I don't know. Now, if they innovate and do a lot more with that and really own kind of the restaurant category and all of the things from the consumer side and their combination of Yelp with Open Table, with Groupon, like that whole thing together, that's probably a big enough idea that could be interesting for a later stage investor like ourselves, or ultimately a public investor. But you ultimately have to start a company with a very niche idea and do that really well, and then you can kind of expand and build upon your strengths. So I think it's a good question. I'm hopeful that more and more companies, as we get to this second, third, fourth generation of entrepreneur, both think big and then can execute on those details to create enough size of a company that would be relevant for us. We're going to be there, and we're hopeful to fund them.
I'm going to come back to that in a moment. We'll just take the question here.
My question turns out to be like 3 questions, but they are all interrelated. So I'm curious, because you just mentioned that there are several gaps in the market in Brazil in terms of solutions that are not filled yet. What are, now I'm going to backtrack, what are the regulatory barriers for startups in Brazil compared to the US in e-commerce and other segments? So in terms of regulations, what are the worst ones for hindering startup growth in Brazil that you see in terms of regulations?
Happy to. I know them well. I don't know if it's exactly regulatory framework, but it's definitely coming from the legal system.
Yes.
I would say the tax system is by far the worst one. It's not only the burden, the amount of taxes that we have to pay, it's how complex it is. And it's pretty much impossible for any company to be able to say, I'm 100% compliant 100% of the time. It's just that way. And I'm not talking about our portfolio companies only. If you go to Pricewaterhouse and ask whether they are fully compliant 100% of the time, it's tough. We have changes in the tax system literally every day. So this is one huge problem. The second one would be, I think, the labor system in Brazil. It's also cumbersome and very expensive. It's expensive to hire. It's a disaster to fire. And this is, it's complicated to allow companies to be flexible and, surf the waves, if you will. So there is a good opportunity. They have to think twice before actually engaging and hiring a bunch of people to take advantage of that momentum, because, it might turn and they might go broke just because they were bold during good times. So I think these would be the biggest two from a legal framework perspective in Brazil. One thing I usually like to say when we're talking about Brazil compared to other countries is, at least I don't know of anything that is different from other geographies that is a burden for foreign investors, and it's not a burden for Brazilian entrepreneurs. So it is really hard, but at least it's hard for everyone. So we have a higher bar, but it is a fair competition ground, and it's different from other geographies. So if you have an opportunity that has a return that is big enough for you to cross that threshold, it is works to your favor in a way.
And if a solution does exist to address some gap or a problem in Brazil that a company abroad, let's say here in the Valley, would have, any of you guys would be, do you try to help companies that have maybe not that big of a company that would like to go to the Brazilian market if an offering would be welcome in that market? If there is a need that has not been fulfilled yet, that's what I mean.
Oh yeah, I mean, we have about 60 portfolio companies globally, and a lot of where we've been helpful both to our Brazilian companies and Latin American companies is expanding outside of their horizon. I think one of the questions that came up was, should a company in Brazil expand outside of there, Argentina and Mexico and other areas? And I kind of answer that, it really depends, right? I mean, Brazil is such a large market in its own respect that, quite frankly, going into Argentina and Mexico and Colombia and Venezuela, it just doesn't move the needle as much as just winning market share and doing well in the Brazilian market. That said, for the right kind of companies, particularly those that are being really innovative and technology oriented, I mean, there's a great company in Uruguay, Scantech, I think it's an Endeavor company, that has those kind of aspirations. It's pretty interesting. Obviously, Mercado Libre and Decalar or Despegar are Argentinian companies that have done quite well of expanding and being pan-Latin American. So I think that those are the right answers. But you look at a company like Lynx, which actually benefits in some respects from the crazy and difficult tax situation. They write all sorts of financially oriented software, POS software that helps to automate a lot of that process for companies. To recreate that and do that in Argentina or Mexico doesn't make that much sense. So I think there are, it all depends. And then if you talk about kind of our global companies, absolutely. I mean, Lenovo, which is an investment I was pretty close with when we helped them buy IBM's PC business, we looked extensively at the Brazilian market for multiple years. Ultimately, finally was able to get something done in that market because we think that's just, there's 190, 200 million people all buying PCs, mobile phones now, but at least at the time when we were reviewing it, that was a huge market opportunity. And so, absolutely, and it's really complex. I mean, it's a pain in the butt to deal with.
Gentleman over there, I think, has some data he'd like to share.
Yeah, it's just to give foreigners an idea about the tax situation in Brazil that we have talked so much. I don't want to scare you. We're still the 7th global economy, so we can deal with it normally. But a gentleman, a tax lawyer, printed out every single regulation for tax in Brazil. Laws, regulations from ministries, constitution, everything, so every level. And it added up to something like 2 king-size beds, one on top of the other, weighing more or less 4 tons. And 16 new pages are added to it every day. So that's the mess that you have to know. So even CPAs, they hire agencies specialized in keeping them abreast with changes to the tax situation every single day when it happens. So that's the size of the complication. And that's why you can't be sure you're 100% compliant, because there might be something that you didn't consider. There might be some novelty that you don't know about, you're not aware, and there might be some interpretation of that regulation because of the so many levels interlinked together that you might not be addressing. Okay, so that's just to give a picture.
So I'm Israeli, and our ecosystem is slightly more mature. Slightly is an understatement. It's quite mature, second probably only to the Valley. Now, most of Sand Hill Road has representation in Israel. Some of them have full-blown dedicated funds just for Israel. Doing businesses in Israel, not a problem, or with Israelis rather, because they're not coming to do business in Israel so much as to invest in Israeli companies. So my question is, why haven't we seen Sand Hill Road establish a presence, a real presence, in Brazil? And is that even going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take it first. I mean, I think you've had different, starts and stops. You do have a number of great kind of local firms that serve the needs of the community, at least today, right? And I think Anderson and Redpoint and Monashis and Kazakh do that. You obviously have guys at Excel that have also been spending time down there. Sequoia had an effort. Actually, one of our vice presidents was doing that effort. Now he's doing his own startup. And I think, I think it's tough. I mean, first of all, it's very far from here. I mean, when I lived in New York, it was easier than flying to California. Because particularly if you think of red-eye flights, right? Because it's 10 hours. The red-eye sucks here because the pilot's so proud that he got there an hour early, but that means that you got an hour less of sleep. At least in Brazil, it's from New York to Sao Paulo, it's almost 10 hours, and so you can get a little bit of work done and still get a full night's sleep and start the day fresh. So I think, but from here, unless you have a plane like some of the folks on Sand Hill Road do have, so that's not even a good excuse for this, it's very far. And so I think that keeps people away from it. It's hard enough to get folks on Sand Hill Road to go to Utah or Seattle or to areas outside of here, so let alone to Brazil. And as a outside firm, that's why we're in a little different position because we're later stage. We're also on the ground there. You're not going to get probably first look at any deal. You're probably going to be, I don't know, second, third, fourth, fifth.
Well, I mean, you have to be there. I mean, that's I think a prerequisite to seeing early deal flow.
But I think there's not. And Anderson should comment on this more than I. It doesn't seem like there's necessarily enough opportunity to justify relative to the opportunity that those Sand Hill Road firms are seeing to open their own office, unless they have a specific strategy or they really want to go deep and really think longer term. in the
Well,
near
it,
term.
it seems, maybe I'll tweak that question. It seems that, I mean, look at Sequoia, right? You know, serious firm, I imagine, you know, or not imagine, but it is. It said Israel, went to Israel. It said India, went to India. It said China, it went to China. It didn't send it didn't have a single person representative that decided to go open a company, and then that's the end of Sequoia at that particular location. Now Bessemer has a person there, so obviously the interest is a little more progressed there. So that's sort of my question. Is it the Brazilian cost we just talked about, the bureaucracy that's just hindering? Is it the distance? I mean, Israel isn't close to anything. It's 2 flights for me anywhere. You know, I mean, you know, Sao Paulo and San Francisco are the same for me.
I think it's the connectivity. I think, quite frankly, I think many of these firms are reviewing their strategies in Israel and in markets outside of Silicon Valley, to be quite frank. And so I think, you know, if you look at where they'll be investing in the future, my sense is, you know, from a returns perspective, they've done really well here. They have done less well in these markets. And so they're constantly reviewing and thinking about that. And I think, you know, if you look at, I don't know, Alan might have statistics on how much capital is already in that market relative to the demands of the market. I think it's not, I'd say it's probably 80% well served. You know, there probably is room for a Silicon Valley firm, and maybe Redpoint's the right answer, or others, to have a presence there, but not a lot, is what my honest assessment would be.
Yeah.
Anderson?
I do not disagree with what you said. I think there is one new aspect to the geography that I think is very promising. So I think a lot of funds looked, a few funds established presence, and I think some of them did it with a dedicated team and fund in Brazil, like we did. Some others are hiring one professional to be there. We see other funds adopting different approaches, having a Brazilian working on their teams here, so that they look at deal flow here and there as well. But I think one way or another, a lot of funds, at least a lot compared to 5 years ago, are keeping a finger in Brazil in different ways. Some are committing in a stronger way and will, you know, have some benefit from that in terms of branding and access. Others are keeping a certain degree of distance. Others are, you know, in and out. But I think the ramp up is sort of clear, especially, you know, with a 5-year horizon, which is not a lot. It's like from 8 deals in, I believe, 2009 to, you know, 70 last year. So 70 is still not a lot, but it's, you know, 10 times more than it used to be. So I think the direction is right. The point that I mentioned was, I believe, inflection point is for the first time last year, we saw the high caliber limited partners that invest in the top firms in Brazil, in the Valley, making for the first time commitment for venture capital in Brazil. So this is one part of the whole ecosystem that was not there before, was putting a lot of pressure in the general managers in Brazil in 2003, 2004. They didn't have access to what is smart money for the VC. People that understand the business, have the patience, understand the dynamics, and will commit really long term. And I like to believe this is something that happened for the first time 2 years ago, and I'm sort of proud to be part of one of the first funds that helped those guys make the decisions. But they are not making a commitment only, you know, to me as a manager, to our firm as a brand, but they are making a commitment, long-term commitment to the geography. So I think before giving that step, they looked at the geography, and then they're taking a long-term bet. So I believe it will grow as opportunities come, and more firms will eventually be present. Obviously, we do not want too many of them to be there, but for now, we are still at the stage that we really want everyone to succeed, and these will be there for a good while. But I think it's growing, okay. So I'm positive about it.
Alan, before you take that, does somebody have a question? Because I'm about to call on someone, so you better prepare. There is. Okay, so he'll answer, and then I'll come in.
Okay, so we set up an office for Endeavor here in Silicon Valley 4 years ago, and I ran up and down Sand Hill Road and showed them the map of all the countries we worked in, which is emerging markets beyond India and China. And most people kind of looked at it like, okay. You know, they were not very compelled or convinced. This is about 4 years ago, right? I think actually today there's actually quite a bit more energy and activity, particularly in markets like Brazil. And really a lot of this has to do with expectations, right? I mean, if people thought that every single of the top 30 firms are going to rush down and open an office in Brazil, maybe that wasn't quite the right expectation to set. I think the more sort of visionary, globally minded venture and growth equity firms are going into these markets. You know, I think it's not that everybody's going to go do it, because many people feel like their strategy is that venture's a local game and they're going to play it more locally. But I think the ones who have the vision actually are doing it and will do it in Brazil, in Turkey, in Mexico, in Indonesia, in sort of this next wave of markets after, you know, kind of the venture only happens in the US, Europe, India, Israel, China, right? So I think it's more than that. But, you know, it certainly has to do with what kind of the expectation was of what might happen in this business. I mean, it's really interesting. I spent a lot of time. I just finished this program called the Kauffman Fellows that kind of trains talent for the venture capital industry.
It's a 2-week program, right?
It's
something.
2 years.
2 years.
Whatever.
Oh, sorry.
But if you look at it 15 years ago, the number of people from outside the Valley who were in the program was 0. 5 years ago, it was like a quarter of the program. Today, it's about 70% of the program. So if that's any kind of a barometer or litmus test, right, there's something interesting happening there in terms of training talent for the venture industry in other places.
Okay, let's take a question and then I'll come back.
Hi, my name is Mark Norona. I'm with SAP, the Startup Focus Program at SAP. I have a question specific to Brazil in terms of cities. How would you compare the startup ecosystems that exist in a city like Sao Paulo to a city like Sao Leopoldo?
What was the second one? Like
Sao Leopoldo, which is the university town close to Porto Alegre.
Yeah.
Any comment on that?
Sao Leopoldo. Yeah.
Would you have a comment on that? We're just curious about how are the university students doing when it comes to creating startups?
Sure, go for it.
We're going to let Anderson take that
Yes.
one. If Brett's been 25 times, I've been maybe 20 or 24, but never to anywhere but Sao Paulo or Rio, right? So.
Yeah.
Florianopolis is nice.
Okay.
Yeah.
That counts.
So I think it's, I'm going to step into a lot of those at once here, but
I'm going to follow you, so go ahead.
the closest to an ecosystem that we have in Brazil today is São Paulo. It's not a complete ecosystem yet, but it's the reality. It's the closest and the one you can find more resources that go around the startup scene. So lawyers that understand what it is to be a startup, consultants, professionals willing to take into those type of jobs. Rio, I think it's a close second. Not a close second, but it's by far the second city that is trying to tap into the same type of opportunity from an institutional perspective. If you go into the let's say, availability of resources, then we have a lot of alternatives in Brazil. There are a couple, frankly, São Leopoldo, I don't know that well, but we have interesting hubs on the academic side. In Salvador, there is an interesting pocket. Recife, we have another one. 100 kilometers from São Paulo, we have Campinas, where I happen to be a student, but there is also, especially on the telco side, there is a lot of activity there. And Florianopolis is one that is upcoming as a small one, but well structured. So we do have widespread pockets, but the reality is none of these are still already ready for, to get the label of a complete ecosystem. But we are getting there. I think every single government is trying to foster the conditions for that to happen, and it's just the beginning.
So I'll say something and then I'll kind of focus it to you guys. It's on the same subject. So in Israel, and it's a small country, I mean, it's a speck, but the epicenter for the high technology companies, and I'm saying anything predominantly from web to even storage and stuff like that, is in a small strip between Tel Aviv and Herzliya. It's about 30 kilometers. I wouldn't even call it, let's just call it Tel Aviv because it's so short, really. It's not even 30 kilometers. Then there's Haifa. okay, where we have our MIT. It's called the Technion. Google has an R&D center there. Yahoo has an R&D center there. Intel has an R&D center there. And yet, it's completely irrelevant when it comes to internet startups or anything that you know, the sexy stuff that we keep reading about. And that's just the honest truth, okay? If you want to build something that's contemporary, that's relevant, if you need the skill sets, if you need the people, you need to come a little closer to Tel Aviv or in Tel Aviv and do it there. And since I've traveled back and forth to Brazil, there's always the question, and there's a lot of initiatives going on, and the government is putting a lot of money into this. And there seems to be, you know, pulling to different sides. So there's Belo and there's Rio, and I think Rio definitely is number 2 only to Sao Paulo. I feel like Sao Paulo seems to kind of, you know, just because of the money, it seems that seems to, you know, everything seems to resonate there, or most things right now. Do you think it's a discussion that needs to be had a little more forcefully, or you know, kind of maybe a little more honestly, to say, listen, folks, we really need to pick a single capital for this thing, and spreading this around it may be noble, but it really isn't effective, because if we want to build these companies, we're going to need the skill sets. We're going to need them to be tight around each other. The lawyers, the accountants, the marketers, business development folks. They're going to need to have lunch with each other as opposed to fly over. Should this conversation be a little more aggressive, do you think? See, I told you I'm going to step on toes. So you know.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. I just...
Alan is a smart one here.
Yeah. Well, I think it's coming actually from Kaufman, if I'm not mistaken. But I think 2 weeks ago, they released the research nailing precisely what you just described, saying that there is a much bigger correlation between the existence of industries with innovation hubs than universities.
Yeah.
Bless you. Than universities and innovation hubs. So it's considered a breakthrough for the US. So it's, you know, there is this belief that hubs like Silicon Valley grew around universities like Stanford and Berkeley, but there seems to be, according to their research, enough evidence that it's not only and not predominantly because of Stanford, but because, you know, Intel, Cisco, and so on. So in that sense, Sao Paulo is ahead, and it will take longer for the other hubs to develop the industries themselves. I think the education is definitely part of it, and if anything, it's a gap we have in Brazil anyways. So I see it's a positive that we do have these different hubs. You know, if Sao Paulo turns to be the best ecosystem, we still will attract talent from these different hubs.
Of course.
Just like, you know, Mark Zuckerberg came from Harvard to Palo Alto to start Facebook. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's too much of a problem. The efforts that you mentioned about orchestrating better, personally, I don't think it's an issue. They are local efforts from usually state agencies, and I would rather see that happening than not happening, just because we selected Sao Paulo as the place to be. I'm more concerned about the market itself, where the market will point as the best place to start a startup. And still today, you know, you see people that, oh, I'm starting this company in Juiz de Fora, my hometown, for example, which is very small. And I say, look, you don't have as much of an ecosystem here that you would have in different places like Rio, which is close by, or Sao Paulo. And oftentimes you hear from the entrepreneur, well, but I can still do it, which is a treat of, you know, entrepreneurs. They believe they can do it, and it's fine. Sometimes you hear from other entrepreneurs that, if that's the best for my company, I'll put that on top of my belief that I can do it here, and I'll take my company to the place where it has the best odds of success.
Do you
and
think,
we like that a lot.
Do you think VCs will push on that? For example, in Israel, there used to be this thing where foreign VCs particularly said, listen, no problem, but you guys got to move the headquarters to the US, and oh, by the way, also put an American CEO. So do you think there'll be some kind of pushback saying, listen, if you want funding, that's perfectly fine, we'll sign, but you guys have to move to Sao Paulo or Rio?
Yeah, I don't know if it will be a precondition. I definitely ask most of the entrepreneurs that I invest in, if they are outside, if you are going to, well, if Sao Paulo would be the best place for you to be, would you move? And not necessarily as a precondition for them to do it, but actually to, you know, have a sense of how committed they are to the project vis-a-vis their personal preference. Sometimes they have a precondition that keeps them where they are, personal, you have all sorts of it. I have to take care of my mother, and there is no way I can move from here. It's true. It's people that we are talking about. Oftentimes it's, no, I'm building something for the energy sector, and I do have a very special network of people that will help me do this here, or I'm building a warehouse or a data center, and here I can get, preferred lot of land to do it. So there are different conditions here and there, but in general, the ecosystem seems to be a big determinant of success, and some entrepreneurs take advantage of that, some don't. Let's see how many of them.
Okay. I have to say that speaking at least for Initial, we don't demand it, but we're clearly seeing folks who aren't move to Sao Paulo. I'm going to take one more question. We're going to take someone else, and then I'm going to ask another question, and then we're going to wrap it up. So we're nearly there. Somebody from up top. There we go.
The last one, so that'll be a quick one, hopefully. In all your investments and connections on the scene in Brazil, it's probably centered around software, new ventures, and I was wondering if you had any visibility into hardware new ventures. Is there any scene there that is active? Are you guys looking at it, not looking at it? What is it missing? That kind of range of.
So I can briefly start just because Endeavor's industry agnostic, so we look at all kinds of companies. Within that, probably 5 years ago in Brazil, we were seeing maybe 20% technology businesses out of our whole top of our funnel, all the businesses we screen. And that's all kinds of stuff, right? Consumer goods, retail, Spoleto is an Endeavor company, et cetera. That has almost doubled in the last 5 years. So now in the top of our funnel, about 40% of the business we look at our technology. And that is starting to be more and more shifting actually towards enterprise and towards hardware. So it's not just e-commerce anymore. So we're seeing them, right? This is the very beginning. They're not big yet, but I think that is starting to happen. I don't know if you guys are seeing.
Yeah, we're agnostic too. I mean, most of our, or many of our investments that have been successful have been internet technology, but I wouldn't say hardware is a trickier one. It's kind of a question of competitive advantage, right? What is the competitive advantage that a hardware company starting in Brazil would have versus someone that starts in Asia, where there's manufacturing capacity and global supply chains? So we just haven't seen that many, but we're open-minded. We don't really care what kind of business it is. Just I haven't seen that many startups come up that way.
Yeah, from our end, we are sort of in the opposite. We tend to invest in companies that are pursuing opportunities we understand well, and our core is on the internet. So it's above all consumer-facing, but also B2B. But hardware, we would consider, but it's not our expertise. So frankly, the odds of us making an investment in hardware-based companies is a lot lower than anything else. But it's it's just how we decided to structure the fund and what our focus is.
Okay, so I have a small question, and another small question. So this is the one before last. Brief answer, but it doesn't have to be a few words. With the rest of the world looking at the Valley here, and whether it's TechCrunch or anything else, or the blog post, or Fred Wilson or anything else, really, when they look upon this area, what is the most beneficial and detrimental aspect of what is happening here and impacting the zeitgeist of building high-tech companies, startups, hardware, super high technology storage, or what have you, upon, let's say, Brazil or anywhere else that you're seeing?
So I'll take a crack at it. I think the most beneficial thing about the Valley 20 years ago and still today is the culture of trust that does seem to exist between co-founders, employees at companies, investors, that there actually is a culture around idea sharing and innovation that Endeavor at least struggles to try to help make this more present in a lot of the places we work around the world. So I think trust, in a very strange way, that may sound like a very abstract thing to start with, but trust is something that you have to have as a baseline foundation in order to enable mentorship, in order to enable idea sharing and everything. I think that ultimately leads to talent coming together and big companies getting built. I think the Valley still does that really, really well. if there's a negative, maybe my negative is, and we saw this in Brazil a little bit, I think sometimes everything that happens now with TechCrunch and blogs and the internet and all the good things that come with more information sometimes come with distorted expectations on what it means to be an entrepreneur, right? So, I started to have a business plan. You give me $5 million now, right? Isn't that how it works? And that's not the most helpful thing, I think. And that does also come out of the Valley, I think, in some ways.
Fair. Anderson?
I agree 100%. I'll try to come up with new ones. So
that's why I went first.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, Brett, you just agree with whatever Anderson says.
Yeah, exactly. Totally agree.
Yeah. So I think the understanding, if not the respect for failure, it is something that there is here and there is not in Brazil. So maybe in the close-knit internet startup scene, it's starting to be there, but our mothers and aunts, they are still not very understanding of the idea of I left a top university, or I could finish a top university and decided to drop out and started a business, and the business failed, and this is part of the process. I think we are 1 or 2 generations from these being truly accepted in Brazil. And guess what? It is part of the process. And I think this is something that there is here, and then we do not have there. Sometimes it's excessive here, and I would pick this as a negative that goes there. Sometimes here there is this, a glorification of the failure, which is also wrong. So it's failing is okay. Failing is not nice, and it's not fine to fail 10 times. Once is okay, 2 is fine, 3 is probably a pattern. And a lot of people in Brazil are looking at the mentality here.
Glorification of it.
Glorification of the failure, and say, oh, it's fine, let's fail 10 times. And then your life is gone and you don't have anything. And this is also a problem. So I would pick that as a potential bad.
All right. Brett, just what they said?
Yeah, I would say failure, but I'll iterate and add another one. I think it's just amazing, just the international, immigration has such a large effect in that it brings people from all different backgrounds, all different perspectives to look at the same idea. And I think you have that in a really unique way here that you just don't have anywhere else in the world. And it's been really challenging, I think, because that different perspective, that different experience allows you to kind of iterate in a different way. And I think, I don't know how easy it is. I met a couple interesting recently Brazilian companies where the founders maybe started in Germany and they kind of came to Sao Paulo. I think there's clearly a large Japanese population in Sao Paulo. So I think that kind of different perspective could be really healthy, and bringing people around the same ideas, I think is great. I think that the key thing I would say is the risk. The lack of risk of failure, which enables you to kind of pursue these big ideas and pick right back up. People have a very short memory. It's amazing. In New York, some of the venture firms, you make a bad deal in New York, and it's like you're over. Here in California, you're one deal away from Facebook. And so I think it's kind of interesting in that respect. And then I think the negative side is. You do have this kind of distorted reality, right? I think it's both, Alan mentioned expectations that people set. I think, maybe it's just the weather. It's so sunny and nice here that people just, they expect everything to be so great, and they're enabled because of that lack or that ability to accept failure to kind of really push ideas in a way, but in some ways it's good. They distort reality, and that leads to great inventions like the iPhone and what Steve Jobs did, and it also leads to just really dumb things that do destroy maybe some productivity and some of the energy. I think there's also because the benchmark is set so high, there's kind of an envy, and everyone is looking at that other guy and trying to be what that other guy is, as opposed to just focusing on their own idea. It's general human behavior. There just happens to be a lot of really successful people in this region. So people are very much trying to either, they don't feel as successful as that next guy, and who cares, right? And so I think there is that negativity that comes from that part of it, and that need to either copycat or beat that other person really quickly, as opposed to necessarily a more healthy environment.
Okay. So we're going to start with you, and then we're going to go down the line. This is the most important question that will be asked in this panel, and by far the most important question of the day. Okay?
Oh no.
Yeah. So like, let's focus, and you guys should pay attention. Literally the most important question of the day. Ready? Favorite churrascaria?
What was it?
Favorite churrascaria?
Churrascaria.
Oh, favorite churrascaria? I'm on the Gracie diet, man. No, I'm joking.
Hey, he said meat, man. It's all legit. It's just what you mix with it. As long as you mix meat with meat, it's fine, you know?
Exactly. I love Churrascaria Plataforma, actually in New York. I really like it. There's one obviously right here in Palo Alto. That's great. And then Fogo de Chão.
Okay.
I'm Fogo de Chão, hands down.
Yeah?
Same.
Really? Pocao. So,
Really?
yeah, well, you know. Thank you, and thank you to Bay Brazil.